They weren't soldiers. No shining suits of armor, no bred-for-battle war horses, no swords stamped with a master craftsman's mark. They were farmers, shepherds living in the high country. Simple men who'd spent their whole lives in narrow mountain valleys, breaking their backs on rocky ground, reading the alpine slopes like the backs of their own hands. But on a November day in 1315, when an army marched toward these Swiss farmers, they stood their ground. Because they understood something the knights didn't. That when you own the mountain, stones become a weapon. What rolled toward them was the Habsburg war machine. Elite cavalry. Warriors raised since childhood to use a lance, carry plate armor, and annihilate whatever stood in their way. Knights, professional killers, mounted on war horse worth more than a whole village could earn in a year. A single knight was worth a dozen common soldiers in the open field. Maybe more. And they were marching by the hundreds. On the other side, Swiss farmers, leather armor, spears cobbled together from farm tools, no formal training, no cavalry school, nothing except grit, desperation, and an intimate knowledge of every slope, every rock, every path in the mountains they called home. Because survival depended on those mountains. The odds were crushing. A Habsburg knight was a medieval tank-full plate armor, war horses bred for war, a lance that could spear through bone and wood. A Swiss farmer, leather jerkins and farm tools sharpened into spears. On flat ground, one knight could handle 10 farmers easy. Yet the Swiss didn't run. Not from foolishness. Because they knew something about their mountains the Habsburgs didn't. November 1315. The Battle of Morgarten. The Swiss picked this spot deliberately. The Habsburgs had no choice but to march through a narrow pass, jammed between Lake Egeri on one side and the steep mountainside on the other. It was the only way to push deeper into Switzerland. It looked like a normal passage, a safe corridor. But to someone who understood the landscape, it was the perfect kill zone. Those mountains had special properties. Steep slopes loose with rocks, passes so narrow that soldiers couldn't spread out. No room to maneuver, no way to use their numbers or their cavalry advantage, and the Swiss knew this ground intimately. Every turn, every slope, every place where a boulder would pick up speed and become a projectile. It was geography turned into strategy. The mountain, they realized, didn't need to be climbed. It needed to be activated. How'd farmers with zero military training figure this out? How'd men who'd never commanded anything bigger than a work crew decide to use the land as their weapon? The answer was leadership from within, not officers trained at some academy. These were men who'd risen up in their communities, locals who understood the mountains because they'd spent their entire lives in them. Men who could read a slope, knew when loose rocks would shift, felt instinctively that a column of heavy cavalry squeezed into a narrow pass wasn't a force to fear. It was a sitting duck. So they got to work. No blacksmiths, no siege equipment. Just the one thing they had plenty of. Rocks, man-sized boulders, head-sized stones, sharp, hand-sized projectiles. All hauled up and stacked on the high slopes above the pass, positioned at places where gravity would do all the work for them. And they waited. This wasn't a reckless move. It was strategic. They understood that on flat ground, the Habsburg cavalry would annihilate them. They couldn't win a straight fight. But mountain combat didn't play by conventional rules. Up there, the advantage flipped. High ground meant 10 times the strength. A boulder had the power of a dozen spears. And an avalanche, that was worth a whole army. The Habsburgs wanted to take over, grab the Swiss lands and lock down the trade routes running through the Alps. It wasn't just about conquest, it was about money. Whoever controlled those mountain passes controlled commerce between North and South Europe. They controlled goods, armies, power itself. The Swiss farmers, no professional military, no powerful allies, looked like a small problem. A nuisance that would be cleared out in a week. But they underestimated something crucial. The mountain does not fight for the stronger side. It fights for the side that knows it best. The Habsburgs marched into the pass, sure of their dominance. The Swiss farmers stayed hidden up high. Quiet. Still. Watching the enemy file squeeze through that narrow bottleneck, horses packed shoulder to shoulder, with zero room to spread out or escape, and that's when it hit them. The land itself wasn't just helpful, it was a weapon a weapon they didn't need to forge just to unleash. The Swiss grasped it instantly, turned the mountain into a battleground where elite knights became slow-moving targets, where that heavy plate armor turned from protection to a death sentence, where years of disciplined military training became a liability. The trap was ready. All they needed was for the Habsburgs to march right in. But how do you get hundreds of untrained men to pull off a perfectly timed strike when everything depends on split-second timing? How do you make sure every rock falls at exactly the right moment to cause total chaos? The answer came down to 3 tactics. 3 moves that turned what should have been a massacre into one of the biggest military upsets in European history. Tactic 1. Terrain selection. Anyone who's played chess gets this instantly. The Swiss picked their ground. They didn't wait for attack. They chose where to fight. And they chose carefully. The Morgarten Pass, a narrow slit between towering peaks and a frozen lake. Picture it, sheer rocky slopes on one side, icy waters on the other that would drag down any armored horse. In the middle, a trail so tight that riders couldn't line up in formation. They had to go single file, spread out for miles like a string of beads. Each knight separated from the rest, unable to maneuver, unable to turn around. The Swiss didn't have to fight an army. They just had to pick them off one at a time, like targets in a line. Terrain was the opening move, the second tactic. That's what blindsided the Habsburgs. The rocks, not pebbles. Massive boulders wagon wheel sized, some over 220 pounds stacked and waiting on the slopes above the pass. The farmers spent weeks hauling these up the mountain, positioning them perfectly at spots where gravity would turn them into weapons. These weren't soldiers with catapults or siege gear. They were farmers doing applied physics. Steep slope plus gravity plus hundreds of pounds of stone equals one thing: unstoppable momentum. Once those rocks went, nothing would stop them. Straight down onto trapped Habsburg cavalry in that narrow funnel. Here's the beautiful part. The Habsburgs had no clue. November 1315, they marched in seeing mountains and rocks. They didn't see the trap. The Swiss let the column push deep into the gorge, committed with nowhere to turn back. And then, they let it loose. Think about that moment. First, just the sound of marching. Then a distant rumble, building, until it's a roar like thunder as hundreds of car-sized stones tear down the mountainside. Faster and faster, smashing everything. The riders looked up and saw death in the shape of rock falling on them. But here's what made it even more brutal. Not one release, not one moment of havoc then done. It was continuous. Multiple release points along the slopes, timed in waves. One cascade of rocks, then another from higher up, then another, like a rainstorm. Except instead of water drops, they were 100-pound boulders raining down on trapped armored men. The horses spooked. Some bolted and crushed the riders behind them. Others lost footing on the ice and tumbled into the frozen lake, taking their armored riders with them. Complete pandemonium. And the Swiss hadn't even closed in for hand-to-hand fighting yet. Here's what you're probably thinking. Okay, rocks are devastating, but how'd these farmers pull off perfect timing without phones or radios? That brings us to tactic 3, pure genius. Coordination through signals. Hidden horns positioned up the slopes, sounded in rehearsed patterns. Visual markers, flags raised at exact moments that could be seen from across the mountain. No guessing. It was orchestrated like a military operation. Werner Stauffacher, the leader organizing this whole thing, had turned a bunch of farmers into a synchronized fighting unit. Every man knew his job. Knew when to push his rocks, when to shift positions, when to charge down with weapons. The Habsburgs were facing tactical precision they'd expected from regular armies, not peasants. But that was just Act 1. The rocks were the softening blow. Now came the close-in part. As the surviving riders stumbled out of the rubble, bleeding, confused, cut off from their units, the Swiss farmers charged down the slopes with halberds. A halberd might look simple. It's really an axe, spear, and hook all fused together. But in practiced hands, lethal. The Swiss had spent years learning how to use them. Could hook a rider off his horse, could puncture plate armor, could grab shields and wrench them away. And the Habsburg knights? Trained to fight from horseback in open space where they could use speed. Stuck on foot, jammed in a narrow pass, hemmed in by farmers swinging halberds. Game over. Within minutes, it turned into a rout. Elite knights trained their whole lives for war were running from farmers. Professional soldiers in armor worth more than entire towns were going down to men with calloused hands from years of farm work. The Habsburg commanders tried to reorganize, tried to make a stand. Too late. Terror took over. Soldiers ditched weapons, stripped off their expensive armor to move faster, drowned in the lake trying to flee. When it ended, the Habsburg army wasn't just beaten, they were destroyed. Hundreds killed, thousands scattered. The Swiss had barely taken a loss. But here's the crucial part. This wasn't luck or accident. This was brilliant strategy. The farmers didn't just live through it, they won decisively. They flipped everything the Habsburgs brought to the fight. That expensive armor, turned it into dead weight that dragged riders down when they hit the water. Those war horses made them panic, trample their own men. Years of military training, worthless when the landscape itself is your enemy. Stauffacher and his farmers didn't pull off an upset despite being massively outgunned. They won because they grasped something the Habsburgs completely missed. War isn't about superior equipment or professional training. It's about controlling the battlefield itself. But this wasn't a one-off victory. It sparked an entirely new approach to warfare. Fast forward to 1388, the Battle of Nephel's. The pattern repeated. 600 Swiss faced 10,000 Austrians. Again, the mountains came down on top of the invaders. The Habsburgs got so spooked, they literally started marking Alpine regions on maps as no-go zones. Not because of fortified castles, but because the local farmers had weaponized the land itself. Armies across Europe watched and noticed. These weren't dumb peasants, they'd figured something out. Those farmers flinging rocks from hillsides had basically invented a new way to fight. Use the ground as your weapon. Military strategists across the continent started analyzing the Swiss victories, trying to figure out how to copy the formula elsewhere. Warfare was never quite the same after that. But the Swiss weren't satisfied. They understood stones worked great in mountains, but if they wanted real power and independence, they needed to win on flat ground too. So that's what they practiced. 1386, only 8 years after Morgarten. Battle of Sempach. This time, no mountains, no slopes, gorges, or piles of loose stone. Open terrain, flat. Perfect for Austrian cavalry and their professional foot soldiers. All the advantages pointed to a Swiss massacre, but the farmers applied the same principle in a different way. No rocks available? Fine. They'd use something else. Pike formations. Long spears gripped by soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in thick blocks, nothing could break through. When the Austrian cavalry charged expecting easy victory, they hit a wall of pikes and steel. Horses got skewered, riders fell. Pure chaos. The Swiss kept their lines, pushed forward steadily, and annihilated the Austrian professionals. The peasants won again. Sempach showed the world something important. The Swiss didn't win just because they had mountains. They were tactical thinkers who could adapt their approach to any situation. Using the environment as a weapon, rolling rocks downhill, or forming human walls of pike that became their signature move. And Europe's military leaders were paying attention. In the 1300s and 1400s, that principle spread across the continent. Commanders started analyzing maps differently, not looking for escape routes, but for where the land itself could work against enemies. They dammed rivers to flood battlefields, turned forests into kill zones, set up gorges for ambushes. The Swiss model of turning terrain into a tactical advantage became standard military strategy. But maybe the coolest part of this story is what came next. Swiss mercenaries. The most feared warriors in all of Europe. These weren't elite soldiers born into privilege. They were those same farmers who'd been chucking boulders down mountainsides. Now they were getting hired by kings, popes, and emperors to fight their wars across the continent. Where they came from didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the track record. Hardcore discipline, creative tactical genius, and an eerie ability to win when they shouldn't be winning. From terrified peasants facing annihilation, to elite professionals because they decided to outsmart rather than surrender. This wasn't accident, it was smart thinking. Other armies sank everything into expensive gear, bloodline war horses, sophisticated weapons. The Swiss worked with what they had, knowing the land, thinking tactically, and turning whatever nature gave them into an edge. The logic was brutal and simple. Can't beat them with raw strength? Beat them with your brain. That idea spread and stuck around for centuries. The Swiss Confederation survived, became powerful, and got their independence not through wealth or military might, but through clever strategy. Every battle sent the same message. We're not weak, we're smart. And brains beat weapons. The Swiss proved that if you know how to use your environment, it doesn't matter if you've got less money, fewer weapons, or weaker soldiers. You win. They weren't tougher or richer, but they could look at a piece of land and see a killing machine where everyone else saw just rocks and dirt. Key lesson here. Superior tools don't mean anything if the other side knows how to use the terrain. So if you dug how everyday farmers weaponized their homeland, how they demolished one of Europe's most elite armies, and how being clever beats being strong, the next video is for you. Because Morgarten wasn't the only time history showed us the underdog winning through sheer tactical brilliance. Hit subscribe to see more stories like this times when brains crushed brawn, when ordinary people pulled off the impossible. History's packed with these moments when stones fell from the sky and giants crumbled. You won't want to miss any of them. See you in the next battle.